Romeo and Juliet. The history behind the story. The story of Romeo and Juliet is based on a story called The Story of Pyramus and Thisbe. Now, if you remember from grade 8 Shakespeare when we did Midsummer Night's Dream, Pyramus and Thisbe also made an appearance there. This is an ancient Roman story and it comes round about from the year 8 AD. And the story goes like this. Pyramus and Thisbe are neighbors whose families hate each other. They communicate with each other through a hole in the wall as they're growing up and eventually fall in love with each other. They decide to elope in the forest. Now, they had to elope because their parents refused for them to get married because they hated each other. And so they decide to go to the forest, to the mulberry tree, which then had white berries and not red berries. So Thisbe arrived at the mulberry tree first, but there was a lion there with blood dripping from a kill it had just made. She saw the lion with the blood and she ran away, leaving her shawl behind. Pyramus then arrives at the mulberry tree and he sees this blood-covered shawl and he immediately assumes that Thisbe has been killed. Pyramus grieves her and mourns her and decides that he just cannot live without her and so decides to kill himself and be dead with her. Thisbe comes back to see if Pyramus has arrived and she sees that Pyramus is now dead, grieves him and decides she also can't live without him and she stabs herself with his sword as well. Their blood splashes on the mulberry tree and turns the mulberries red, and that is why we now have red mulberries. Now, this story of Romeo and Juliet, of lovers who cannot be together, has been around for a very long time and has been made into various stories and poems and whatnot. And so in 2 AD, there is a Greek story, Ephesiarch, Xenophon, and Ephesus, the tale of Anthea and Habrachames, that comes from Greece in 2 AD. Then in 8 AD, we have Pyramus and Thisbe. In 1530, a man named Luigi de Porto wrote a version of the story in Italian, and in 1554, another Italian, Matteo Bandeo, took the story and made it into a novelle. Now, a novelle is like a novel, it's a story as well. In 1562, an English author took this novelle and translated it into a poem that was 3,020 lines long called The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. And then in 1597, William Shakespeare wrote the famous play that we know today, Romeo and Juliet, and it was published. Now we need to look at the differences between Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and Brooke's Romeo and Juliet poem. So first of all, Mercutio and Tybalt, in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, they are developed and complex characters. They play massive roles in driving the plot, in carrying the story. Whereas in Brooke's poem, they are just names. They're just names that come up in the poem. Juliet's nurse, in Shakespeare's story, she serves the plot's purpose. She helps drive the plot. And there are multiple scenes where you can see really deep affection for Juliet, where you can see that their relationship is not one that is superficial, but a really deep relationship. Whereas in Brooke's poem, she's only mentioned in one single couplet. Now, we need to look at how the authors view the lovers. What is their attitude towards the lovers? And so Shakespeare, he's very tender and often amused in the way he speaks about the lovers and the way he makes their interaction. And it's always a very gentle, loving interaction. And he actually gives them a few days of marriage until they die. In Brooke's poem, he openly disapproves of them. He does not approve of their love at all, but he at least gives them 3 months of marriage instead of just a few days. So the question we need to ask ourselves here is, were audiences then watching a story they already knew? So if we had these stories from 2 AD, surely Elizabethan audiences knew about the story before Shakespeare brought it out in Romeo and Juliet. What you need to remember here is that Elizabethan audiences were very satisfied watching a story they already knew, as long as the dramatist or the writer provided a new perspective, a new treatment of the story and its characters. This is very much like modern audiences. We seemingly have the same satisfaction. West Side Story, a very popular musical, award-winning musical, follows the exact same plotline as Romeo and Juliet, and we will actually be watching a couple of scenes from West Side Story. But think about this. Disney brings out live actions of the same movie that we've watched, and we all anticipate it. Star Wars brings out a new trilogy that's very similar to the original trilogy, and we all go out and watch it, and we love it. Now we need to look at the setting of the play, Verona, known as the City of Love. So the Montagues and the Capulets are based on real families that were in Italy, the Montecchi and the Capuletti, and they were real feuding families, but they were actually from Siena instead of Verona. But Shakespeare loved Verona, and so he decided that Verona should be the setting of his play. In Verona, there's the Casa di Giulietta, which is a 14th century mansion with the Capulet emblem on the mansion. As well in Verona, there's the bronze statue of Juliet, and people say that if you touch her right breast, you will have good luck in love. In 2010, a romance film called Letters to Juliet with Amanda Seyfried came out. It is based in Verona, and the plot is driven by the various legends surrounding Juliet and, of course, her lover, Romeo. So we need to ask ourselves, is this play still relevant? Should we still be studying it? Is it still something that applies to us in our modern day? And yes, the answer is of course yes. So why? Because love is an integral theme in the play, and we are all searching for love, be it family love, be it romantic love, friendship love. But more than that, one of the bigger themes is meaningless hate defeats true love. And that is a very big theme in our world today. If we look at how meaningless hate leads to lives lost, leads to wars, leads to all of these horrible things. We see that the lovers' deaths are a symptom of this blinding hate, and so the play presents a lesson in the consequences of senselessness and of hatred, and how senseless the death can be, and how absolutely ridiculous it is that these two families hate each other so much that their children commit suicide because of it. And it's a lesson for all of us to learn about hatred in our day. So this quote comes from the prologue. The fearful passage of their death-marked love is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage. And that is really where we're going forward now as we start studying the play, is the fearful passage of their death-marked love.